Welcome. My name is Karen Greenberg. I'm the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham Law, and it is my pleasure today to participate in a fireside chat with Joshua Geltzer on the topic of a very timely topic, domestic terrorism in the United States. Joshua Geltzer is Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy Homeland Security Advisor at the NSC. Pertinent to today's conversation, Josh Geltzer has been the White House point person for domestic terrorism. Formerly, he was at Georgetown Law, where he was the first director of ICAP, the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. Welcome, Josh. Nice to be here with you.
It is wonderful to be here with you, Karen. Thanks for doing this. Thanks to Ali and Colin and everyone who helped put this together.
Let's get right into it. So, Josh, my understanding is that you oversaw the production of the first ever national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. It was released in June. It was an interagency effort, and you had a role in organizing it, writing it, and thinking about it. And entitled The National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism, it outlines the threat that the country faces in terms of domestic terrorism and a very wide array of possible countermeasures that range from public awareness to paying attention to the distribution of guns and to how to counter specific individuals and groups. So my question to you, just for the very start, is who are today's domestic terrorists in the United States?
The answer to that is not simple, Karen, but it's important. The intelligence community, the law enforcement experts who provided us with the threat assessment that then drove how we thought about strategy and policy have told us, and they've said this publicly through the testimony of leadership across our government, that there are a wide array of ideologies and viewpoints that are motivating some number of individuals to take that unacceptable step of turning violent. They categorize these in a few ways. Let me give you a sense of some of the categories that worry the experts the most. One is the category of racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. This includes, though it's not limited to, those who promote the superiority of the white race. Then you have categories such as anti-government, and that can be anti-government for a lot of reasons from a lot of perspectives. And then an array of ideologies and frankly, some viewpoints that are even hard at times to characterize as coherent ideologies. But the basic answer, Karen, is that as we think about the domestic terrorist threat today, we can't limit it to one particular worldview, certainly not one particular entity organization. There is a range of grievances and sets of viewpoints that are leading some people to turn violent with those grievances.
So in some way, it's obvious that this is not the same kind of terrorism referred to in the post 9/11 world, which basically referred to transnational jihadist terrorists, that we're really dealing with something else. And yet we still have the word terrorism. We have so many laws and policies and procedures that have been put in place by the United States to counter terrorism. And again, this is another hard question, but what are the basic differences you see in terms of policy challenges that distinguish how you look at domestic terrorism versus how you might look at transnational terrorism?
But it's a hard but critical question. It's a question that we asked ourselves often during this review because we wanted to know where there were and are lessons to be learned for domestic terrorism from 2 decades of a lot of focus on international terrorism. And every bit as important, maybe more important, we wanted to understand where lessons were inapplicable. So let me say quickly, one thing that's similar is the idea of taking political grievance, taking worldviews, taking ideological motivations and turning violent. That is something that is unacceptable to civilized society, unacceptable to democratic society. And that, in a sense, is something of a commonality between international terrorism and domestic terrorism. It's essentially the definition of terrorism. And so that's something that's similar. But there's a lot that's different too. In a sense, one thing that's different is the critical nature of protecting civil rights and civil liberties, especially in the context of domestic terrorism. It's important in all contexts, but here it can be a particular challenge, and those of us who work on it, I think, need to be particularly sensitive to the difference between addressing violence when people decide they're unhappy at the ballot box or unhappy with a policy decision or unhappy with the legislature and turning violent with it, in which case they're breaking the law and the approaches set out in the strategy need to kick in, versus those who simply hold a wide range of political views, ideologies, perspectives on the world. And it's fair game in a democracy to regard some of those as abhorrent or repulsive or whatever the right word might be, but it's also still fair game to hold them so long as they are held peacefully. So the protection of civil rights and civil liberties, where the context is domestic, where there are views being expressed that at times pivot from, take elements from, intersect with the range of political discourse in this country. That looms large because it requires a real careful protection of civil rights and civil liberties. That leads to a second set of issues, and we should dig into it more, Karen, if you'd like, which is authorities issues, because the authorities for things the United States does beyond its own soil, from intelligence collection to some of the military aspects of our international counterterrorism, those just don't map on and shouldn't map on to work done on US soil.
Yeah, I mean, I want to point out that one of the most important threads and themes throughout the report is the repeated reference to civil liberties protections, and not just in terms of First Amendment protections, which you do spend some time talking about in the strategy, but also in terms of privacy protections, given the world of data and the role of the internet in recruitment and motivation to violence, and also some references to due process. So I think so really what I wanted to ask you, just to follow up on that, is the report talks a lot about democracy. It talks about terrorists as a threat, to taking it one step further than, threat to the government, threat to, to certain points of view, a threat to democracy itself. But what I also read in the report, and I'd love you to talk about this a little bit, was the sense that the wrong response it bears some responsibility as well to the erosion of democracy. And so my further question to you is, you refer to this as a complex, multifaceted, and evolving threat that's out there. And I guess the question is, are we going to get control of this? And is there a way to value democratic principles while at the same time we're fighting those who are counter to democratic principles in so many ways?
I think if we do this work right, we are reaffirming our democracy and a fundamental tenet of it, which is we resolve our differences of opinion, we resolve our differences of political views peacefully. We do it through the ballot box, we do it through the legislative process, we do it through other parts of our government, like the executive branch whose building I'm sitting in right now, we do it through the courts, but what we don't do it through is violence and taking things into our own hands through violence. And so, to my mind, addressing domestic terrorism doesn't just address a public safety challenge or a national security challenge. It does those things, but it also reaffirms our democratic principles because, in a sense, what's one thing that's distinctive about domestic terrorism, because it's domestic in nature, is that it is being driven by those who are or should be part of our polity, part of our society, part of our discourse, but who are making that choice, the choice you keep hearing me describe as unacceptable, of taking their dissatisfaction, their frustration, whatever their grievance might be, and turning violent with it. So that's not just a danger to the individuals who might be at the location of a particular attack, the individuals who might be recruited to doing something terrible. It is those things, but it is something more fundamental. It is a challenge to the nature of this wonderful experiment in democratic self-governance that all of us who work in government are sworn to try to uphold and defend.
When we think about the international terrorism context, we think about groups like Al-Qaeda, hierarchical, in many ways, organized, on message, But when we hear about domestic terrorism, we often see lone actors and small groups, often loosely, connected individuals. To what extent is this a movement of, maybe not even a movement, a set of lone actors and small groups? And how does that change the challenge that you see for the country?
What the intelligence community, the law enforcement experts say is very much what you're saying here, which is that a manifestation, those who have actually undertaken acts, attempted acts of domestic terrorism in recent years, have been not exclusively, but often individuals or small groups coming together informally, sometimes last minute, to undertake these sorts of acts of violence. That's set out in the expert assessment of the threat that was provided to us early in this process, and that we embed the unclassified executive summary of in the strategy itself, so that readers can see the threat to which this strategy has been designed to respond. So what does that mean?
You're referring to the DNI, Director of National Intelligence report that came out?
Exactly right. It's worth pausing on this too, because this was something set in motion by leadership here, truly the first week of this administration, knowing the priority we would place on addressing domestic terrorism. That very first week, the request went over to our intelligence community and law enforcement community leadership to provide a comprehensive assessment of today's domestic terrorist threat. And that came to us right on time at the beginning of March. It was released shortly thereafter to Congress in full. The full document is classified, and at the same time released to the public in unclassified summary form. And then, as I just indicated, re-embedded in the strategy itself. And the reason I dwell on that, Karen, is we thought it very important to put aside whatever preconceived notions, even biases we might bring to the question of what is the threat we're addressing, and instead hear from the experts, hear from the professionals to tell us, to allow them that chance to tell us how they see the threat, its trajectory, what its key facets are, so that we would be designing strategy and policy in response to their best assessment. Mm-hmm. So anyway, what that emphasis on individuals and small groups means, and at least one aspect of what it means, is that sharing information and intelligence on this threat can look different from how we might think about sharing information and intelligence on some of the more traditional international terrorist plots. And to provide something of a contrast here, we all learned the lesson as we read the 9/11 Commission report, as we heard the hearings that follow, that if there is a particular plot, that there's some intelligence on, that intelligence needs to be shared across the federal government, or at least the pieces of the federal government that do this work and need to know, and at times with state and local partners who are, of course, key elements of our country's national security and public safety defenses. That is true. It's true in the international terrorist context. It's true in the domestic terrorist context. But in the domestic terrorist context, where so often it's individuals or small groups who don't have those elaborate multi-month plots, but have things that are smaller, more spontaneous, or at least close to spontaneous, that we need to, and we are, sharing different types of information on trends and trajectories, information on particular dates or events or gatherings that might be more likely to be targeted. All of these are ways in a persistent threat environment to help inform those on the front lines of protecting Americans from this threat, while recognizing that this threat does have the dimension that you're describing here, that individual and small group dimension.
Speaking of those on the front line that are protecting the country, the strategy does not shy away from talking about the reality of extremists within law enforcement, within a number of branches of government that would, directly or indirectly be part of the security framework. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that issue and what the strategy suggests in terms of a remedy?
Here's how I think about it, in part from personal experience, Karen, which is those of us who get the opportunity to serve in different parts of our government, whether it's a policy role like this, whether it's serving in the military, whether it's serving in law enforcement, we get opportunities and we have responsibilities. And the opportunities, depending on the part of government, can include opportunities to be trained in very specialized ways, to have access to certain weapons, to have access to certain information and intelligence. And that's all to do our jobs for the American people. What the strategy, I hope, conveys is those sorts of positions of trust cannot be allowed to be abused or exploited by those who would take that same access to training, to weapons, to whatever it might be, and try to recruit individuals to exploit or abuse that for nefarious purposes. We owe it to the others who might be in danger because of that. We owe it to the American people to ensure that when these positions of trust are made available, that those who fill them are worthy of that trust. And that has meant that our Department of Justice, our Department of Homeland Security, our Department of Defense, each of them has announced that it is scrutinizing how it assesses those brought in and those kept in those types of positions so that they can't be recruited to do bad things with those opportunities. And it's a response, in a sense, to the quite explicit, quite deliberate recruitment of those types of individuals, both in their roles and thereafter, in the case of veterans, that some of these domestic terrorism promoting groups are going about doing online and otherwise. And so they say they'd like to try to recruit those people. We as a government, of course, need to thwart that. And that's what you see reflected in the strategy, but maybe even more importantly, that's what's being reflected in the work that is underway across our federal government. In some ways to do this across the federal enterprise, and then in some ways to do it department specific, because every department does have its particularities.
Right. And we've seen that the Pentagon, for example, has announced that it's doing a review of its employees with this consideration in mind. You mentioned the DOJ, DHS, DOD. And, you know, after 9/11, there was this intense focus on the interagency process for the reasons you talked about, Josh, which was the sharing of information and making sure that the dots get connected in the post 9/11 context. But in looking at domestic terrorism and in reading the strategy, get a sense that there are new players that are being brought to the table in this interagency dialogue. Who are they?
That was quite deliberate. And again, starting truly the first couple of weeks of this administration, we started having the thinking, the meetings, the work that resulted in that strategy, but even more importantly, continues in the form of implementing the strategy. We realized that, yes, we did need around the table some of the traditional parts of our government, law enforcement, State Department, military, but we also needed others, as you say, Karen. We needed HHS, we needed Veterans Affairs, we needed the Department of Commerce. Each one is seeing in its own way different manifestations or permutations of the domestic terrorism challenge or its knock-on effects. And in some cases, each may have solutions for their constituencies, for their stakeholders that they can help bring to the table. And in fact, one of the ones I mentioned goes right back to the earlier question, which is the Department of Veterans Affairs, which of course seeks to support and empower and protect our veterans in close coordination with the Department of Defense. And so it was important to us that everyone from VA to those other parts of our government be part of these conversations. So at a bare minimum, we were collectively hearing how this challenge was affecting the stakeholders whom they serve.
Interesting. I want to turn a little bit to some of the challenges, countering extremism. And one of them is the use of the internet and the way in which it, in the words of the report, accelerates recruitment, accelerates mobilization to violence, or can accelerate it. That's a very dicey field to get into, both in terms of the public-private conversation and in terms of the civil liberties issues that we talked about earlier. And so I just wondered where are we as a country in the trajectory of the conversation that needs to be had about the damage that the internet can help along? And how do you see that? And just a little bit on that.
I think the internet, in a sense, looms a bit large in this strategy document because it looms large for today's domestic terrorists and how they attempt to recruit and radicalize. It may not be exclusively happening online, but the ability to reach out, appeal to people's grievances, radicalize them further, engage with them, sometimes initially through social media, then moving those who take the bait, so to speak, who seem responsive, moving them into end-to-end encrypted chat groups or even one-on-one conversations. That cycle, that pathway, which is familiar in a sense from the international terrorism context, that is central, at least, to how domestic terrorists are trying to spread their message today and recruit adherents and followers. And so the prominence that it receives in our strategy is a direct reflection of the prominence it receives from domestic terrorists as they work to recruit and mobilize. But all of that is done with an eye towards ensuring that we are addressing violence and threats of violence while allowing free expression to flourish. And the internet is host to both. And one of the ways in which we have tried to work through the complexity of all this and to do it in a multi-stakeholder setting is by announcing that the US government, just a number of weeks before we released the strategy document, had joined the Christchurch call to action to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. And the Christchurch call had been originally set in motion by the French and New Zealand governments in the wake of the horrific Christchurch shootings just over 2 years ago now in New Zealand. And it brings to the table a wide range of governments, of tech companies, and of civil society to talk through exactly the set of really hard issues that you're pointing us towards, Karen. What does it mean to address violence and threats of violence? What does it mean to address very real and very deliberate attempts to exploit and abuse social media and other platforms, while at the same time allowing free expression, allowing free speech to flourish? And we are committed to working through those issues in that setting, and of course, in other settings as well, including in our own US government attempts to educate and inform the technology sector about how we see certain threats online.
Another issue that you referred to throughout the strategy is guns and gun flows and the prevalence and accessibility of assault weapons. It's hard to know how that policy could play out in terms of, actually stopping the flow of guns. Who does that? How does that happen? And is that a goal that can be achieved in today's current context?
And let me even maybe step back slightly and situate this in the context of what's called the fourth pillar of the strategy, which is the pillar that we describe as long-term contributors to the domestic terrorism threat. And these are a set of challenges to this country, to this democracy, that are bigger, broader in some ways than the domestic terrorism threat, and yet they feed into how the domestic terrorism threat manifests itself today. So we don't claim in the strategy that we can quickly or easily solve any one of them, but at the same time, we do claim, I think rightly so, that sustainably setting back the domestic terrorism threat means confronting and tackling and making progress on these issues. And there's a range of them. The strategy talks about racism and how some of the most dominant strains of domestic terrorist recruitment ideology today are driven by and in turn further drive racism. The strategy talks about polarization, often fed by disinformation and misinformation, often spread, not exclusively, but often spread online. Again, these are the types of issues that are broader than domestic terrorism, but they feed into how the domestic terrorist threat manifests itself today. The access to certain firearms is one of those drivers. And in some ways, it's just intuitive. Access to certain weapons can make acts of domestic terrorism easier to perpetrate and more lethal when they are perpetrated. And so it is one of those things that, especially with our wonderful colleagues at the Domestic Policy Council, which has been working a number of firearms-related initiatives closely with federal law enforcement and others, including providing certain model legislation to non-federal partners as they try to tackle this issue, including working through the distinctive threat posed by ghost guns, as they're sometimes called. These are issues that they are working hard and that intersect and feed into the domestic terrorism threat as well. It
is true that the report, the strategy, does make a lot of historical allusions and references to that's somewhat comforting in a funny way, which is we've known we have these issues, these problems, these challenges. Sometimes we've addressed them, but here they are in a different form again. And there is a part of that is, okay, we need to learn how to manage this and deal with this, but it's not out of the blue. So that's interesting. One thing,
Karen, can I even just stay on that for a minute, because the history is really important, and I appreciate you're bringing it up, because we worked hard to try to situate where we are in some historical context. And there's a sense in which domestic terrorism is, regrettably, it's just not new to this country, and especially to certain communities that have been targeted by domestic terrorists for far too long. And a few weeks before we released the strategy, the president was in Tulsa, marking the 100th anniversary of the just horrific race massacre that occurred there, calling it acts of hate crimes, which it was, calling it domestic terrorism, which it was, and indicating that the strategy was going to come out just a couple of weeks later. That sort of history, and we referenced Tulsa explicitly in the document, was important to us to see that there is an arc here in which this threat in some form has been with us for far too long. At the same time, we wanted to make clear the ways in which today's version of the domestic terrorism threat is new and novel. And that includes some of the technologically driven aspects that you and I were just talking about, the role of the internet in facilitating terrorist recruitment and radicalization. So we wanted to try to acknowledge both the long arc of history and the newer developments. And hopefully that comes through in the strategy.
It definitely comes through. But what's new and novel, you say, well, one thing that struck me as new and novel was among the remedies was public awareness. The idea that how important public awareness is to resolving some of these issues in a way that keeps everybody more safe and secure. And I'd love to know a little bit about the broader context of how that conversation developed, and for you to elaborate a little bit on what is meant by public awareness.
It's really important, because one of the consistent research findings in and out of government over years of studying not just terrorist violence, but also what sometimes gets targeted violence, described as targeted violence, meaning it may not be politically motivated, but it has other shared characteristics, is that someone often sees something that worries them along the way, whether it's a family member, a friend, a coworker, a peer, a mentor, a coach, a teacher. Somebody sees something changing, and changing in ways that specifically make them worry about the potential for violence, but they often don't know what to do about it. And that even if they think they know what to do about it, the sense of stigma, of burden, of whether they should proceed to do something about it can lead to at least hesitation. And so what in particular the Department of Homeland Security has worked to do, and is now working to increase across the country, is build the right connectivity in communities to facilitate those who are worried about a loved one, a friend, a coworker, to find the right outlet for indicating that. What that looks like differs in different communities. This has been another consistent finding, which is that this needs to happen at the community level. In some communities, it may involve educational entities, and some research entities, and some community centers. But to help build the right connectivity so that those who can see something that worries them say something about it, and help those people get help, guide them away from a pathway towards breaking the law, attempting violence, which will change their lives, not for the better, and also protect their own community. That's something that it needs to happen at the community level. It needs to be spread across more communities. And you're going to see more from the Department of Homeland Security as they continue this effort in the weeks and months to come.
Is this one of the reasons that Health and Human Services was brought into the conversation in this sort of evolving interagency paradigm? Or
they do play a critical role too, because one thing among many that HHS offers to Americans is if they or if a loved one feel that they have concerns about violence, including violence perhaps driven by some sense of stigma or mental health condition, whatever it might be, they offer nationwide help, a hotline that you can call and get help. Now, the vast majority of those who call that hotline, of course, are not calling because of violence, whether concerned about themselves or others. But to the extent that there is, in some set of circumstances, overlap between those seeking help and the chance to prevent violence, we, of course, want to maximize that. And so they do have a role to play in helping for some Americans get help that they or their loved ones may benefit from in the right circumstances.
One of the other things that surprised me about this report, which I sort of encourage everyone to read this national strategy. It's extremely thoughtful in many of the ways that some of us who have spent a lot of time thinking about this are just, it illuminates a lot of things that we needed illumination about. It's very good. But one of the things that surprised me the most was I'm trying to think of the right word, the calm attitude towards a domestic terrorism statute, which has been debated in recent years in a variety of circles. And the gist of it is that, there are many that think they need a domestic terrorism statute equal to the statutes, I should say, that address international terrorism. And there's been a lot of pushback on this, in part because of the way the statute for foreign actors was applied, for foreign terrorism was applied. And just a distrust in the idea of adding yet another way, another tool that could be used in ways that were discriminatory, that abused civil liberties across a wide range of issues. There didn't seem to be an aggressive desire to have this, but rather a reflective, let's see what happens. Let's talk about it. Let's vet our concerns and let's see what happens. Are you content with that?
First of all, thank you for the very kind words about the strategy, and grateful for it on behalf of all those in government who worked very hard to try to get this right. And you use the word reflective there about the consideration of potential statutory change. I think reflective is just right. We felt it important to have a strategy that was entirely doable the day it was announced. In fact, we've been working on doing parts of the strategy even before it was announced. And in some ways, the strategy is an opportunity to provide a coherent, comprehensive vision of the whole effort in this area. But given the urgency of the threat, and I say that having walked into this White House complex on January 20, with the opportunity to return to government 2 weeks to the day after the horrific set of acts of domestic terrorism and other illegality at the Capitol, the sense of urgency, the sense of needing something that could be done to rise to the moment, to rise to the threat we faced, was palpable. At the same time, it felt far too soon to take off the table the possibility of, especially as we monitor how implementation of the strategy goes, considering whether any legislative change felt appropriate, given the need both to protect Americans from domestic terrorism and protect civil rights and civil liberties. And so that landed us exactly where you described, Karen, which is to indicate in the strategy that our federal law enforcement leadership is studying whether it sees legislative reforms, legislative updates appropriate, all things considered in this area. That will then come forward to a broader part of the government, whatever that recommendation is, and we can work through what the next steps would be. But that was the balance of ensuring we had a strategy that could rise to the moment and address the threat and be entirely doable under existing authority, while allowing our federal law enforcement leadership to consider whether anything more feels right on balance.
One of the things that a number of reporters and analysts have referred to, and terrorism experts, are the connections between international groups that are basically white supremacist groups in other countries, and individuals and small groups and small and larger groups in this country. But recently, you've seen that sort of minimized in the sense that this is really much more a domestic threat. And while there may be some ties, it's not really on the level that some experts have described. do we know the answer to this question yet? And if so, where do we see this?
So we have a bit of an answer. And I think in the unclassified executive summary of that threat assessment, you see some indications consistent with testimony on the Hill from Director Wray and others over the past months, which is that there is certainly some connectivity, albeit informal often, between domestic violent extremists in the United States and those abroad who share their motivations for encouraging violence, their worldview. There is limited travel, but some travel. You saw in 2019, the US government announced an entity and 3 of its leaders as specially designated global terrorists. These were the first white supremacist designations of this ilk under that authority, an entity called the Russian Imperial Movement. We stand ready to utilize those types of designation authorities, SDGT, as well as foreign terrorist organization authorities, where the facts and the law support it. But often, as those who work in our government on these issues continue to scrutinize the latest intelligence, the nature of these entities, the diffuse nature of them, their often online heavy presence and shifting permutations make it challenging to see whether they meet the thresholds for those sorts of determinations. That all being said, part of what the strategy calls for, part of what we're doing, is learning more, increasing the priority of understanding the transnational context around this whole issue. That includes understanding connectivity between domestic and foreign actors in this space. And to the extent that that kind of lights up, illuminates networks that we didn't realize before, it may well allow us to bring to bear authorities in new ways, precisely because we understand the transnational dimensions more fully.
I want to address something we talked about earlier, and I want to just, look into it a little more deeply, which is there's a constant refrain throughout the strategy about violence versus language versus words. It's one thing to say heinous and hateful things, and another thing to take action. I think there are a lot of individuals, both professionals and just the lay public, who think that's a very hard line to describe. It is a hard line. Do you think that given past history, given where we stand in terms of racial tensions and the new kind of domestic terrorism, do you think there needs to be some kind of education throughout the system about where that line, and maybe throughout the public, about where that, and maybe we need to ourselves think about it, where that line is, how to adjudicate it, how to set it out, how to abide by it?
I guess I'd say it's a hard line, but it's a line that at least aspects of our constitutional system is built on. And so it demands all of us to patrol that line and guard that line, even when it can be a challenge to figure out in very specific circumstances what might fall on one side or the other. But that is that distinction, the critical one that you're making between saying heinous things versus getting violent based on heinous views or heinous beliefs. That is the difference between being offensive but potentially legally protected and breaking the law. And so I think ensuring that as we tackle this issue, and we need to, because the threat is real, and we need to protect Americans from it, protect our democratic integrity, but at the same time doing so in a way that doesn't just protect, but actually, I think, reaffirms our commitment to the free flow of ideas, the full spectrum of beliefs. I think we can come out of that with both a safer public and a reaffirmed, robust protection of speech and expression. It's, of course, easier said than done, but I think we can do it. And I think this strategy reflects a commitment to staying laser focused on violence and threats of violence while safeguarding free expression, free flow of ideas.
So bottom line, it's not just about the threat. It's not just about the counter threat, the countermeasures. It's about democracy. And that seems to be the bottom line of this strategy. So Josh, thank you so much for joining us and taking this time out from your extremely busy schedule. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for all you've done to help advance this important conversation in the public domain. And thanks for the chance to speak with you right now.